Welcome to So-and-So, brought to you by Bernina, Made to Create. I'm Meg Goodman, and you're about to enjoy a casual conversation with a special member of the sewist and quilting community. A conversation about how they got started, what inspires them, what excites them, and their connection to this community. Our guest today is Beth Donaldson, quilt maker, quilt book author, and Associate Director of the Quilt Index, an online repository of quilt information housed at Matrix Center for Digital Humanities and Social Sciences at Michigan State University in East Lansing, Michigan. Born and raised in suburban Detroit, Beth made her first quilt in 1974. She taught quilting beginning in the 1980s and has written 2 books on quilting, Block by Block and Charm Quilts, and co-authored 2 others, Quilts and Human Rights and Quilts and Health. She's taught, lectured, and run quilt retreats, and in 1997 got a job in the quilt collection at the Michigan State University Museum, where the Quilt Index was developed. Beth has since retired from the MSU Museum, but still works on the Quilt Index, which now contains 96,860 entries. Beth has 2 adult children, 1 grandson, and she and her husband of 45 years make their home in Lansing, Michigan. Hello, Beth, and welcome to So-and-So.
Hello, thank you for inviting me. This is such a pleasure.
You know, we are excited to have you learn more about you and certainly the Quilt Index, which I find to be fascinating. And I don't know if our listeners are aware of it, but as soon as they have learned of it on this episode, I'm sure you will find many, many coming to that site. So we're excited to learn about the index, but first, though, let's get to know you. How did you learn to sew and quilt?
So, sewing was always big in my family. My sister is a supreme seamstress. My mom always sewed. There was always a sewing machine in the house, and there was always a lot of fabric. And then in 7th grade, I took a home ec class, and that helped refine my skills. So, that's how I learned how to sew.
So there were sewists in the family. Did they inspire you in any way on your quilting journey?
Not so much. I was the 4th child in 5 years for my mom. So she wasn't really didn't have a lot of time to sit me down and teach me things, but it was just always around, and it always felt doable and attainable because so many people around me did it.
Okay, so let's talk about your first quilt and your favorite quilt. Tell us about them.
So my first quilt was in 1974. I was a junior in high school, and my friends and I decided that we were just going to make a quilt because it seemed easy. So we sat around and we cut out triangles. Now, we didn't worry about whether they were all the right size because we were more garment sewers, and so accuracy wasn't a high priority. So when we finally got enough triangles, I sewed them together in hourglasses, 4 triangles making a square. And I sewed all of those together. And I wanted to take this off to college and I wanted it to be warm. So I backed it with flannel and I put in 5 layers of batting, and I machine quilted it on my mom's old Singer, and, those things could go through anything.
Sure.
And so I took that to college, and after about 5 years, it died under its own weight. So,
Well, I was 5 layers. I was going to
yeah,
say that's notable.
yes. But I like that heavy feeling when I sleep.
You know, I can relate to that. I understand. Do you still have any remnants of that quilt?
I do not, and I'm not sure if there's even a photograph of it anywhere.
Uh, well, it's in your mind for sure.
Oh, yeah.
Uh, Talk about your favorite quilt.
So I have a favorite from the museum, which is called "We Wish You a Merry Christmas, Mrs. Haft," and it was made by schoolgirls, and the date appliqued on it is 1873.
Hmm.
And the reason I like it so much is because it was machine quilted as you go. And that was the topic of my first book, Block by Block. And so to find that not only was it machine quilted as you go, but it was very similar to the method that I thought I invented. So
And you came to find out that that wasn't the case.
No, there's nothing new under the sun, and I just have to chuckle a little bit about all the copyright arguments because nobody invented quilting that we can pinpoint.
Sure. Now, in the introduction, we talked about how involved you are in the quilting community and how involved you were before you came to the Quilt Index. So, talk to us about some of the best things you remember about your time pre-Quilt Index.
I was very involved in my local quilt guild, the Capital City Quilt Guild, and that started in 1984. And I was at the first meeting, and we elected officers, and I was elected the vice president, even though I was only 28 years old and I didn't have that much quilting experience. And then the next month, the president left. And so I got to be the second president of the Quilt Guild.
Hmm.
And I was really lucky to have a board that was very experienced, and they shared everything with me and they taught me so much about organizing and that kind of stuff. And then when you belong to a quilt guild and you volunteer, you make friends. And we
Hmm.
had a lot of small groups that would meet weekly, and I belonged to a few of those. And you meet with them over, 5, 10. You turn around, it's been 30 years. And so you have these really long standing, deep friendships that are built while quilting. And the thing about being a quilter is I just feel like no matter where I am in the world, if I find the quilters, I'll find some new friends.
That's the community.
Yes.
So you, in addition to being a member of the Quilt Guild and a quilter yourself, you've written books and you have taught quite extensively. Any special moments that come to mind about your teaching?
Yeah, not particularly. I taught at a very, very popular quilt shop, and that's where I developed how I was going to machine quilt as you go. It was just so fast, and you were just teaching, 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 and you really learn how to work with fabrics really fast because I would do a block of the month, and there would be 30 or 40 women signed up because it was lecture style, and they would all want help picking out their fabrics. And so one of the things I learned about quilters is they may not be able to say yes, but they certainly know what they don't like. And that's as helpful in helping them pick out the fabric as
Hmm,
them telling me what they do like.
sure. I want to take a moment and ask you to explain the technique of machine quilt as you go.
So there have been a lot of quilt as you go techniques. And the thing that I didn't like about them is you could tell where the breaks were, where part one met part two. And I didn't like that.
Hmm.
So what I wanted to do is develop it in such a way that you couldn't tell that it was machine quilt as you go. So if you look at a lot of my quilts, and especially as they get bigger, almost all of them are machine quilt as you go.
Hmm.
And you can't tell where I connected it up. So the basic idea is you you've got two blocks, right? Or two sections. So one section you quilt all the way to the edge. The section that's going to connect to it, you stop quilting within about 2 inches.
Hmm.
Then you trim the backing a half an inch larger than the top, and then you trim the batting. So then you take the top layer of the side that wasn't quilted all the way through and you stitch it through all the layers of the side that was quilted all the way to the edge.
Hmm.
Flip it over, trim the batting so that the raw edges meet of the batting, and then you've got that extra half an inch to turn under and stitch down on the back side.
Got it.
I don't know whether you followed that, but
I did. I have this picture in my mind, and thank you for doing that. So everybody understands what you've been talking about, and your favorite quilt. You also mentioned that it was an example of that.
right.
Beth, you taught classes, and this is fascinating to me, in your sister-in-law's historic hotel. Tell us about this hotel and why it's special to you.
So my sister-in-law no longer owns it, but it's up in Petosky, Michigan, which is, for people that aren't aware of Michigan, it's closer to the Mackinac Bridge, way up north,
Hmm.
and it's right on Lake Michigan. So they bought this hotel from 1911, and there's certain weekends that were always hard to fill. So you could always get people to come up in the summer, and then in the wintertime, they had a lot of ski people. And so I said to her, I said, "Well, what are your two worst weekends of the year?" And it was the weekend after Mother's Day and the weekend after Labor Day. So I started inviting teachers to come up and teach classes up at this hotel. So
Hmm.
the hotel had 50 rooms, and some of them were single rooms, some of them were double rooms, but it was the perfect size that I could fill up all 50 of those rooms. So we took over the whole place and we had meals. And the first one I did, I hired myself to teach, but I wasn't a real big draw. So I had to fire myself and then hire some more famous people.
Hmm.
And that filled it up. And then once my book came out, I was famous enough that I could rehire myself.
I love that. I love that. Beth, and now we know more about you, so I want to talk about the Quilt Index. And let's combine the two with the first question here. How did you get your job at the Quilt Index?
Okay, so are you aware of quilt documentation?
I am not.
Okay. So in the 1980s, there were a lot of women that were starting to seriously study quilt history. That core group turned into the American Quilt Study Group, which anybody can Google and go join. They're really a great group. Um, but anyway, they didn't like the idea of so many quilts that didn't have the maker's name attached to it. And they looked at all this beautiful work and they thought, who is the woman responsible for this or the person responsible? So they decided to document quilts. And what that meant was they would choose a day, get a group of volunteers, usually quilt makers. They would get a church basement and they would set up tables and they would have a photographer. So they would invite the community to bring their family quilts in. And what would happen is you would take your quilt from table to table. One table would be about who made the quilt, if you knew anything about that, or about how you got the quilt, if you're just the quilt owner. The next table would be a physical description of the quilt: length, width, fiber content, color, quilt pattern name, that kind of stuff. Then the last station you would go to would be the photography station where they would hang it up and they would take pictures of it. So this was going on all over the country. And it was usually a statewide kind of thing, right? And once a state documented about 4 or 5 thousand quilts, they decided they were going to write a book. So they would have a committee sit down and they would choose maybe 300 or less quilts that they thought were book worthy, and they would publish these books. So we're seeing, a curated selection of the quilts that were documented.
Hmm.
So in 1984, I was with our Quilt Guild and I got involved and was a volunteer documenting. And it was the Michigan State University Museum that was doing the statewide project in Michigan.
Hmm.
So after we had documented a bunch, they asked for volunteers to be on the committee to choose which quilts would be in the book. So I did that as well. And what I noticed was I had very different taste from Marcia McDowell, who is the current director of the Quilt Index and eventually hired me at the museum. But she's a folklorist and she really loves a good story. So if the quilt has an interesting story, she doesn't care what it's made of or what it looks like. I, on the other hand, I'm a technician, and one of the things I teach is precision piecing. So to me, a quilt is interesting if it has a lot of little pieces, if it's technically masterfully done, if the
Hmm.
colors are beautiful. And so, that gave you a nice range of quilts that you saw in these books, but it made me wonder what happened to all the quilts that didn't get picked for books. where are all those records at? So
Hmm.
anyway, in Michigan, we documented eventually over 11,000 quilts. So I'm quilting, I'm doing my thing. We did some quilt retreats in Lansing and some quilt festivals, that kind of thing, where I worked with Marcia again. And then in the 1990s, she was doing some fundraising to acquire a collection of quilts by a woman named Mary Schaefer. And I volunteered to help do that. And she liked the work I did, and I'm really good at organization, and I'm really savvy with computer software. And so then she hired me part time at the MSU Museum. And at the time I got hired there, we had about 400 to 500 quilts. And by the
Hmm.
time I left 25 years later, we had 1,100 quilts. And that was all due to Marcia McDowell. So I was a collections assistant, which is kind of the lowest rank you can get in a museum. And she is a museum curator, a PhD, the director.
So it's amazing how all of this just organically popped up and grew. Now you said that this is done nationwide. How did Michigan State end up being the repository for all of the nationwide information?
So it's 1998. By this time, I'm working at the museum, and there were a couple other people, Lynn Swanson and Mary Worrell, who were also really involved in the quilt collection. And we had been talking about what happened to all of the records for all of these quilts that were documented, because I could see all these boxes and boxes of records where I was at the museum, but every state had a wall full of records. And all of these records were handwritten. A lot of the images were either slides or Polaroids. And so we thought, wouldn't it be great if we could see all of those records online? And that was the germination. And so to get grant money, you really needed a national effort. So that's when Marcia started joining with others around the country who had the same thoughts.
Hmm.
And so that's how it ended up with us, is that Marcia was the one that wrote the original grant.
So it sounds like just a Herculean effort to do this. So can you explain how it's coordinated and how people get involved in helping?
Yes, it is a big task with a very, very small group of people. So Matrix, which the Center for Online Humanities at MSU, they are our digital home. And they're the ones that provided the programmers and the designers of the site.
Hmm.
And so they continue to maintain the site. And one thing people don't understand is that code degrades. So you have to have somebody constantly looking at the code that your website is based on to make sure that spam didn't get in there, that codes didn't change, that there's different standards that you have to do. And so that's what Matrix does for us. And when you donate money to the Quilt Index, part of it goes to that kind of maintenance.
Ah, okay.
Now, as far as how you get participants. So we have a lot of the statewide documentation projects participated. And when we wrote the grants, we would write in different statewide projects, and that would give them the money to do the work to transfer the data from handwritten paper to digital records and to scan the slides and the Polaroids. If you weren't written into a grant, you can join the Quilt Index as a statewide project, and there are fees involved, and those really depend on the number of records you have and the amount of work that needs to be done on those records.
Hmm.
So, one of the things that happens is everybody has a different form that they did their records on. And there was not one giant form that everybody agreed to, because everybody's was working in their statewide silo. Also, different states had different questions. For instance, in Arizona, one of their questions was, when was the quilt brought to this state? Because so many people immigrated across the West.
Hmm.
Whereas that's not really something you ask in New York.
true.
or Vermont. So part of the job of the Quilt Index was to gather all of these questions and make one database where all of this information could go into, which is why if you look at our form, it's like 8 pages long
Mm,
because we were incorporating everything everybody wanted.
sure.
Also, if you don't ask the question, you won't get the answer. So we never expect that you're going to answer every single question on the form. But if we don't ask it, then you're not going to tell us whether it was made of cotton or silk. Or some things you can't tell by the photograph. We can't tell what you put on the back of the quilt, but you can tell us if we ask you. So, having all of that said, when a different group of data comes in, it's usually my job to match it up to what we're doing in the Quilt Index.
Hmm.
And I call that data cleaning. If you do that cleaning yourself, then you would pay less money because I wouldn't have to do it for you. Now, along with the statewide projects, we have projects from other countries. So we have a bunch from Alberta, Canada. We have some from Ontario. We've got some from the Netherlands, from South Africa, and we're working on getting Sweden in.
Hmm.
We also get a lot of different museums that want to document their quilts. So sometimes it'll be a museum in a state that didn't do documentation. We also have museum records from state documentation projects. I work part-time and I'm the one that just manages and juggles all the data.
Hmm.
So if you go to the contact page, it just comes to me.
Okay. So you were talking about all the states and entities that are involved. How many are there?
Well, right now we've got about half of the states, and it's really hard to count exactly because many states had more than one documentation project going on at the same time,
Mm. Hmm.
and there was never one place where you would tell everybody what you were up to. So we as the Quilt Index, we still don't know all the documentation projects and where they happened.
Hmm.
We would like to know, but I mean, how do you find them other than Googling? And what about if they don't have a web page?
Hmm.
Some of these projects were done by individual people. And a lot of the projects, like from the 1980s, well, those women were maybe 50 or 60 when they did the project, and now they're 80 or 90, or they're not even with us. And some of those records are under people's beds.
Hmm.
So it's a real inexact in terms of, how much of it we have and how much of it is out there.
So there could be numerous hidden gems out there, and I would encourage our listeners who are sharing this conversation, if you have information that you think might be of interest to Beth and the Quilt Index, reach out to her. You might just have one of those gems hidden under a bed or in a trunk or something. Beth, if people are interested in contacting you, how do they do that?
So they can email me at donald20 at msu.edu, or there's a contact page on the Quilt Index, and they can fill that out, and that comes to me as well. And thank you for encouraging people to contact me because you know, yay, I should have said that myself. Um, but also, we now have a submit a quilt page where anybody can go in and add their own quilt to the Quilt Index. It
Mm.
used to be you had to go through a statewide project, but not anymore. Now you can just put it in yourself.
So let's talk about some of the quilts that are contained in the index. Are there some very notable or special ones you can tell us about?
Oh, yeah, there's, you know, so many.
For
But
days, for
yeah.
days.
So did you know that Rosa Parks was a quilt maker?
I did not.
Yes. And Susan B. Anthony?
Huh.
So those quilts are in the Quilt Index. There's another woman, um, and I'm remembering her last name, but not her first name. Her last name is Bond, and she is the aunt of Julian Bond, the civil rights leader.
Hmm.
And what she did is she didn't make quilts, but she designed quilts. And her husband, she was African American, as was her husband, and they were working in the 1930s in the Tennessee Valley Authority on the big dam projects to bring electricity to those rural areas. And there were a lot of Black men that worked on that project. And Mrs. Bond's husband was an engineer who was managing that project. And it was her job to get together with the women. And so she designed these quilts around the project that groups of women made. And they're known as the Lazy Man Quilts because it's a picture of a Black man deciding whether he wants to work for the government and make the dams or devote his life to wine, women, and song. So there's 4 of them, and they're in the Quilt Index. And then there's another one that's not in the Quilt Index, but we do have a photograph of it. And it's a quilt she designed, and it's a black fist with a lightning rod in it, and it says Black Power. So that is like the first time that you saw the phrase Black Power used in that context.
Hmm.
So very, very cool. Then we have Baltimore Brides quilts. We have Marikay Waldvogel and Barbara Brackman wrote a book about the Sears Century of Progress contest in 1933. And that contest was nationwide. They gave away $1,000 to the prize-winning quilt, and they had 25,000 women enter that contest. So Waldvogel and Brackman researched it and have been finding these quilts, and so there's a whole section devoted to those quilts in the Quilt Index. And when we find another quilt from that project, then we can add it to that page as well. There's another woman named Bertha Stenge who was the queen of quilting in the 1940s, and she was out of Chicago. And her quilts won all kinds of big prizes at the New York World's Fair and the Women's Day contest. And she was so well known that her quilts are in museums all around the country. And a bunch of those quilts are in the Quilt Index, but also I have photographs of some of them that are like in the Chicago Institute of Arts that have not yet been formally documented. But she has an artist page. And if you go to her artist page, you can see all the quilts we've been able to find by her all on one page and all in one spot. So it's a way that you can compare them that you can't do in real life. And anybody can have an artist page. So I have an artist page, and if you go there, you'll see old newspaper clippings that I've added to the Quilt Index, trade cards that are really funny from the 1890s where the woman says, "A new home sewing machine or a divorce, sir." It's my favorite.
I love it.
And then all the quilts that I've made, and then also all the quilts that I own.
Uh-huh.
And so I can pull that up on my phone because, when you're amongst friends who aren't sewists or quilters and they say, "What do you do?" They kind of look at you and glaze over. Well, you can pull this up and say, "Here's what I do."
I love it. I love it. And it seems like you could just go on for forever on these stories. So I
Yes, I
want
could.
people to know about how to use the index. Take us through an experience of going online, using this resource. What will people find there? I mean, to introduce us to the index and how to use it.
Okay, so because there's almost 100,000 quilts, there's thousands of pieces of ephemera. And ephemera is the museum term for old newspaper clippings, old patterns, that kind of thing. Then we also have exhibits, we have essays, we have galleries, we have all kinds of stuff. So think about it this way. Every quilt has its own individual page and its unique number. However, that page can show up in all different areas of the Quilt Index. If you go into the Quilt Index for the first time, there's a menu at the top of the page. And I encourage anybody to just click on anything there, and it will be a sub-menu that comes down, and you'll start to see quilts. And for instance, if you click on quilts, it's going to try and load 96,000 quilts. That's a lot to try and look at and figure out what am I looking for?
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at the sub-menu, you can look by time period, you can look by pattern name, you can sort. So you can sort by the maker, you can sort by the state it was made in, you can sort by the date it was made. I think the next item on the top is stories. And those are stories about groups of quilts or anything that's particularly special about a quilt. So we have a quilt called The Road to Recovery that was made by a lady named Mary Gasparic. And she has a particular story about why she made this quilt and all the symbolism of the quilt. And the quilt was made in 1939 for the New York World's Fair. And then her nephew made a wood version of that quilt. So that's also part of that story. Then we have artists. Anybody can have an artist page. And when you have an artist page, that means you don't have to keep filling out the artist section of the form over and over again because you did it one time. But that's the place where you can look at all of your quilt making activities. Then we have resources, and resources are exhibits, galleries, essays, and lesson plans. And so the part that interests me the most are the exhibits, because exhibits don't last forever. They're up for a few months and they're gone. And so if you go there, you can see the exhibit, you can see all of the research that went into the text panels and the object labels of the exhibit, and it can live forever. Now, when you go around the Quilt Index, I just want to caution you that you'll see a lot of stuff from the Michigan State University Museum, and not because it's better than anybody else's, but it's because I had access to it all,
Mm-hmm.
and I had permissions to everything. So I tested all parts of the Quilt Index with the MSU Museum. Galleries are just, like things together. So you might find a gallery of Laura Wheeler pattern quilts, that kind of stuff. Oh, collections was another one on the top menu. Collections are the different documentation projects. Under collections, you'll see special collections and you'll see museum collections. So if you want to know if your museum, your state or the state you're going to has any quilt museums, you can click on museums, you can sort by state, and then you'll see all of the records of the museums in that state. Another thing you can do with the museums is you can sort it by number of quilts. So if you want to make sure that you're seeing the museums with the most quilts, sort by that, and the International Quilt Museum, of course, comes up first. But that way you're not wasting time with a little historical society that may only have 2 quilts. Also special projects and special collections are collections within a collection. So the MSU Museum has an African American quilt collection. It has a Native American quilt collection. It has the Cuesta Benberry collection of ephemera and quilts. And so those all have their own page, so you can look at those discrete units of collections. They can also be private collections. There's a woman in Arizona that has a fabulous collection of quilts. And so she has her own collection page where you can click and see the 1,000 quilts that she's collected. Let's see. So we've gotten that far across the menu. Anyway, just keep going through the menu and clicking on stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you get to an individual record of a quilt, if that maker has an artist page, there will be a link to it at the bottom of the page. So my idea is when you're wandering around the Quilt Index, you might find something interesting. And then whatever links at the bottom may lead you back to whether it be the maker of the quilt. Maybe there is an article in Uncoverings, the Journal of the American Quilter Society, that relates to this quilt. Maybe you're looking at old center medallion quilts from the 1850s, and you go to one, you find one, you look at the bottom, and it's going to link you to an essay page by Marikay Waldvogel, where she talks about how the fabric used in those quilts was actually manufactured just for quilters in the 1830s.
Hmm.
So, I want you to just sort of fall into the Quilt Index.
I think that's a perfect way to explain that. I think somebody could just spend hours and hours there. Would you remind us of the URL where people can find this?
Yeah, quiltindex.org. You can't break it.
Oh, perfect. And I will tell our listeners, I have been on the Quilt Index, and it is very intuitive, very user friendly, and just a lot of fun. You find something amazing around every click.
Thank you. And I also want to mention the searches. So if you go to the search page, there's a keyword search that will search everything about the quilts, or you can search in individual fields, and there's just, you'll see that on the search page. If you are doing a search that contains more than one word, use quote marks, and that will refine the search so you don't get 10,000 results. Also, when you get to the search page, there's a sub-menu. So if you want to search through the collections, the ephemera, the resources, you click on the sub-menu and you'll get a different box to search through that will search through those areas.
Out of all of the facts that are, and they are beyond counting, do you have one favorite thing about the Quilt Index?
My favorite thing about it is that it's not curated. We want every quilt. We want quilts that you don't think are worthy of the Quilt Index. The idea behind the Quilt Index is the history of quilt making, not the history of interesting quilt making or the history of good quilt making or whatever you think is worthy. We want to see what everybody's up to and how everybody quilts. And that's the beauty of quilting itself, is everybody can do it. I happen to be, I love a feathered star. I love to make them. I love to draft them. I love nothing better than being a 16th of an inch different on this side of the diamond than that side of the diamond. I realize I'm not really normal that way. Other people get in front of their design wall and they're totally intuitive and they just put that up, and if that strikes them, I always have in my head exactly what I'm going to see in the quilt, and it always turns out that way. But you don't have to quilt that way. You don't have to match points. You don't have to be flat. You don't have to use it into a quilt. There's just everybody's welcome and everybody's interesting, and that's the way the Quilt Index is too.
Beth, what's next for you?
Well, I'm 67, so I'm kind of happy where I'm at.
Hmm.
So, um, what I've been doing the last year is refolding all my fabric. I have an entire wall of fabric that I
Hmm.
cannot sew in my lifetime. And so I've reorganized it all. My daughter's a therapist, and I'm making a quilt for her wall. And of course, she sent me a pattern, a beautiful pattern by Elizabeth Hartman, but I just can't follow a pattern from somebody else. So I'm, of course, rewriting it based on everything she's done.
Hmm.
So that's been fun. And just, more quilting, more Quilt Index. And of course, I have a 4-year-old grandson now, which is a delight.
What's next for the Quilt Index? Any big plans?
Yes. Well, we're going to have 100,000 quilts soon. So that's going to be a big deal for us. I am awaiting this afternoon the records from the Georgia Quilt Project. That'll be 8,100 more records.
Oh my.
We also have something big coming that I can't announce yet.
Then I encourage people to keep their eye on the Quilt Index.
Yes, yes.
Beth, in our conversation today, we talked about a lot of things. Is there any question I didn't ask you that you wish I had?
You know, I could go on and on and on, as you've probably gleaned already. So no, there's no question. But if anybody has a question that we didn't address, please email me.
And please remind us your email address and where to find you and anything else people would like to look for.
So my email address is donald20 at msu.edu. That's DONALD20 at msu.edu. If you go to the Quilt Index, just Google Quilt Index, it pops right up. There's a contact page. And if you go to that page, you can fill out that form, and that comes to me as well.
Perfect. Beth, this has been wonderful and just enlightening. There's so much there. It's been wonderful to talk to you, and I want to thank you again for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Well, there you have it, another story about someone just like you, someone for whom sewing and quilting is so much more than a hobby. It's a way of life and a connection to something bigger. If you know someone you think has an outstanding story, a story that should be shared on this podcast, please drop me a note to meg@soandsopodcast.com or complete the form on our website. Be sure to subscribe to, review, and rate this podcast on your favorite platform, and visit our website, soandsopodcast.com, for more information about today's and all of our guests. That's SEWANDSO podcast.com. And finally, I want to thank Bernina for making this program possible. I'm Meg Goodman, and I look forward to you joining us next time on So and So.